Welcome to the Do Good Work podcast. Today we're talking to Phil Johnson. Phil is the founder of the Master of Business Leadership Coaching Program, or MBL for short. And for the past 21 years, Phil has been running the MBL program and helping executives and organizations achieve remarkable results across the world, including alumni in the US, Canada, UK, Europe, Japan, Africa, Australia, and the Middle East. Phil is focused on helping executives and is on the mission to help executives and organizations understand the value and importance of emotional intelligence. In today's podcast, we'll dive into the definition of emotional intelligence, and Phil actually goes through a live exercise with me, which is pretty interesting, and I found it very insightful, and I hope that you find it as insightful. Now, let's go to Phil.
Well, Phil, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Raul. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Phil, there's one thing that you mentioned from one of the videos that you produced online on kind of like a pivotal turning point in your life. And I kind of want to share what that pivotal turning point was and how that led to the work that you're doing today.
Well, a couple of things. I was born with dyslexia, which caused me to do a lot of what I now refer to as emotional labor. It was my mother's death in December of 1967 that really motivated me to change the trajectory of my life in January of 1968. And I've really been on that path for 54 years. And the Master of Business Leadership Executive Coaching Program is kind of a culmination of that journey.
And let's talk a little bit more as well, like, because your business acumen, it's not just the fact of, the emotional labor, which is in an inner working in itself, but I kind of want to know a little bit more about, like, how does that translate into the work that you're doing today, and the work that you're doing today, how does that impact the leaders that you're working with?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. We're facing a tsunami of change. We're facing accelerating change. Some scientists have estimated that in this century, we could experience the equivalent of 20,000 years worth of change or 200 centuries worth of change. So change is increasing at an exponential rate. And we've got a 500 million year old brain that doesn't like change. What I mean is that whatever we take in action that moves us outside of our comfort zone, there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, which for the last 500 million years has been trying to keep us safe and alive by making sure we never leave the safety of our cave. So when we do, it secretes a hormone into our bloodstream called cortisol, and that causes the executive center of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, to shut off. And we typically go into some type of fight, flight, or freeze mode. Some people lash out, some people run away, some people freeze like a deer in the headlights. And when that happens in conflict situations, people die. And when it happens in business or personal situations, relationships die. We burn trust. So as an analogy, if you think of your amygdala as a very frightened 4-year-old child, our emotional intelligence acts like a big brother or a big sister to quiet the amygdala response down and better enable us to feel the anxiety that change and innovation creates in us and move through it towards the vision of our desired results, as opposed to allowing that anxiety to control us. So more and more companies like Apple, Google, Southwest Airlines, JetBlue, Infosys, Whole Foods, FedEx, and others are more and more hiring, promoting, and developing emotional intelligence.
No, it's quite an interesting statistic about the levels of changes, how that results to, like, end of day listeners out there, even myself included, like the level of stress that equals the negative consequences that you mentioned. Kind of want to go through with our listeners here, if you don't mind, kind of like an exercise of, we hear emotional IQ, and I hear that as a trend. It could be not a fad, but it sounds like, oh, you just have to have your emotional IQ. But what does that actually mean? Because at the end of the day, people are asking, why does that matter, and why should it matter for me? And I kind of want to nail that answer here by going through an exercise around emotional intelligence, and maybe something that we can all practice either on a day-to-day basis or in a conflict situation within our work environment, with our peers, with our bosses, if you're working in a career, etc. I want to be able to kind of work through that with you, and I'm open to hearing any frameworks or steps that you take or you have.
Let me give you one of the MBL habits that we coach in the process, but it's called authentic listening. And the key to authentic listening is that how somebody feels about you has nothing to do with you. It has to do with what's going on inside of them. So if how we feel about ourselves is determined by how somebody else feels about us, who's in control of our life, them or us?
Sounds like it'd be them, right? Or
Right. So we're actually giving away our energy to determine how we should feel about ourselves based on how other people feel about us. If you like me, I like me. If you don't like me, I don't like me.
yeah.
That's crazy. But so by practicing the habit of recognizing that how somebody feels about you is about them and not you, allows you to keep your walls down, allows you to become less resistive, less judgmental, less attached to outcome, and you become more curious about wanting to help them as opposed to wanting to run away from them or kill them.
Mm. Well, hopefully
Um,
not kill. I mean, in the work
hopefully,
environment.
yeah, yeah, just
No, I know.
hypothetical.
I
So,
know
so
that's
the
like the
point is,
extremes of the brain. Now that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So, how somebody feels about you, whether they like you or whether they hate you, is all about them, and we shouldn't take that on. By not taking that on, um, it allows us to stay objective and more focused on looking for solutions as opposed to raising our walls and becoming more resistive, judgmental, and attached to outcome. It reduces the drama, chaos, and conflict within the interaction.
So one of the things that I want to address here is, and I want to also contrast this with your story and you growing up, but I feel like right now where we're at in society is that we're leaning in a lot into feelings, and we're leaning in a lot into if something makes me uncomfortable or not. And like it sounds to me here, there's two factors. One is that if you if what you can do yourself is if you, let's say, work out and you have a healthy, rush of dopamine and you're happy to see someone, then you're going to like that person. But some other people may not have similar habits and they may not like you because they may be going through something difficult. Now, what I'm hearing is that me as a person, let's say I'm talking to person number A and that person doesn't like me, I should either A, not care about it, or two, not take it serious, or three, like not worry too much about it because of the fact that they may not like me because it's their own problem, not my problem. But then from there, I'm seeing a split between kind of where we're at culturally, where some people might take that personally and offensive versus being a little bit more strict of mind or callous mind and not take that, person not liking you too personally. Does that come across my point? That I feel like right now in society we're not as strong-minded. Do you see that in a trend? Is that something that you're seeing with students?
We're yeah, as a society, more and more we're driven by fear,
Hmm.
by ego-based fear, and the fear is actually causing us to become more judgmental, more resistive, more attached to outcome. It's causing us to raise our walls, and it's increasing the toxicity, the drama, chaos, and conflict within organizations.
Mm.
And that fear is going to increase as the rate of change continues to accelerate. See, we're not equipped, we're not prepared to handle change, especially rapid and accelerating change. We need to, and this is where the development of our emotional intelligence is so critical. We need to be developing our emotional intelligence so that we can deal with the anxiety that change is going to produce in us, in all of us, but not allow that anxiety to control us, not allowing that anxiety to stop us from moving forward towards the vision of our desired results. We can't stop the rate of accelerating change. All we can do is develop our emotional intelligence so that we can handle the anxiety that that's going to produce in us.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's dive into that then. Maybe if it's a simple practice that you have, or if it's a framework to follow. So we talked about, listening intently, and then being aware of other person's, mindset when they come to a conversation with us that may not, our output may not equal to what they receive, and they may still think differently of us. But what are other practices that we can put into place, or protocols, per se, that you would guide people through so that we can buff up and build our emotional intelligence?
The results that we're currently getting are a reflection of our current habits. We're only conscious about 3 to 5% of the time. The rest of the time, our behaviors and our results are determined by our unconscious habits.
Mhm.
So, if we want better results than we're currently getting, we have to develop better habits. We can't get better results with our existing habits. If we could, we already would. So, developing new habits, or what's called neural network pathways in our brain, is something we can do at any age. It's called neurogenesis or brain plasticity. But that requires us to leave our comfort zone,
Mhm.
and that creates that anxiety.
Yep.
So it's a chicken and egg thing in a sense, because we have to be willing to do the emotional labor of moving out of our comfort zone through the anxiety that that's going to create in order to develop and strengthen new habits. And in that process, that's how we develop our emotional intelligence. That's how we become more inspirational leaders. That's how we raise our level of consciousness. So this journey, the development of emotional intelligence, is an experiential process. It's not an intellectual process, meaning that you can't develop emotional intelligence by reading a book or watching a video or talking about it.
You got to do it.
It's about, yeah, you got to do it. It's about what you do. It always requires an initial leap of faith, because you can only connect the dots in hindsight, because you don't know what you don't know. And it's only by starting down this path, moving down this path, that you're able to develop these new habits that enable you to stop giving away your energy to other people. An analogy I like to use is of the journey is the penny doubling. If you take a penny, you double it every day for 31 days. Day one, you've got a penny. Day two, you've got 2 pennies. Day 31, you've got $10.7 million. The point is that it doesn't take any more effort to go from day 30 to day 31 than it did to go from day 1 to day 2.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, it looks like you're doing a lot of work for a little, and you are, because you don't know what you don't know. Later on, it looks like you're doing a little work for a lot, and you are. And by the way, day 40 is over 5 billion, day 50 is over 5 trillion. There are people I've been working with for over 12 years, because the ROI keeps getting greater and greater and greater and greater as they practice these habits.
That makes a lot of sense. So I think that this gets me to the a point to say, let's get uncomfortable. What should we be doing, or what kind of habits should you recommend? Because we need to get to the what. What habits should we start implementing or looking at or changing? And then 2, how do we measure growth in our emotional IQ? Like, what does that measurement look like? Is it a feeling? Is it an actual outcome in with other people? Is it just a self-awareness? And then 3, what is the actual progress? Are there certain milestones? Or, I mean, I'm a little bit illiterate here when it comes to like the progress of emotional IQ, but as a simple man, I think like, well, is it like a milestone, like with your white belt and a yellow belt and maybe a black belt? Like what does this look like? So let's start with the first step. Like, what are the habits that we should be cognizant of that we can start going into our day? If you're listening to the podcast in the morning or in the evening for tomorrow or today, what should we be aware of? What can we do today?
The habits, there are habits like becoming a more authentic communicator, a more authentic listener, habits about being responsible to versus for others, listening, making decisions. There's a myriad of habits that can cause people to stop giving away their energy unconsciously to others.
Let's define that. What does that mean, to give my energy away unconsciously to another person?
Okay. This is the foundation. uh, what I'm about to tell you, I've been proving for over 21 years all over the world. The root cause of all drama, chaos, and conflict is our giving away energy. Let me explain. When we're born, we're not born with a conscious mind. Our conscious mind doesn't kick in until we're about a year or so old. But we are born with an unconscious mind, and we immediately start wiring up our brain. We begin creating the habits in order to survive, get food, fit in, survive. And a lot of those habits are what I call victim habits. They're habits that cause us to unconsciously give away our energy to other people. And we do it in a myriad of ways. And when we're giving away our energy over here, it creates an energy deficit in us. So at the same time we're giving away our energy over here, we need to steal energy from other people over here in order to replace the energy we're giving away. And that dynamic is going on inside of everybody, everywhere, all the time, all over the world. So what we do in the MBL program is we show people how they're unconsciously giving away their energy over here and give them better habits of practice to stop doing that. And when they stop doing that, their need to steal the energy of other people over here goes away because they don't need it.
Yeah.
And in that process is how you develop your emotional intelligence, you become a more inspirational leader, and you raise your level of consciousness about what's going on in you and around you all at the same time.
What are some of the common ways people give away energy, though?
Well, one is in listening. We just talked about it. Another one is in our communications. I'll give you an example. Yeah. Would you like to go through a little bit of a quick experiment here?
Let's do it.
Okay. On an average day, do you consider yourself a high or low energy person?
I would say high energy if I work out in the morning.
Second, well, on an average day, you would consider yourself a high energy person.
Correct.
Second question, on an average day, are you more focused on people and emotions or results and tasks?
A mix of both, mostly on the outputs or the execution that needs to happen that day, but also caring about the people that I interact with that day. Not sure if that answered your question.
Well, pick one.
Let's just talk about outputs.
People, results, and tasks.
Yeah.
Okay. So from a communications point of view, you have no problem telling the truth.
Absolutely.
And you're a bit of a visionary.
A bit.
But sometimes when you're facing deadlines, when you get a little anxious, you can tend to maybe use the truth to beat people to death with. You become less conscious about how they're going to receive that truth and more just a little bit more micromanaging.
I don't think micromanaging is the word, but yeah, I'm not afraid to be bold and be transparent what needs to happen.
Okay. So what I would suggest is it's always good to tell the truth.
Yeah.
Don't ever not tell the truth. But telling the truth by itself is not enough to be an authentic communicator. You need to tell the truth with compassion for the person you're speaking with. And by compassion is not weakness, it's strength.
Correct.
You can tell the truth with compassion without having to take responsibility for their actions. So that by telling the truth with compassion, you're going to become a more inspirational leader. You're going to be building trust with people around you. So that's another way you can not take other people's energy and not give away your own.
Oh, that's interesting. And it's good to be cognizant of that as well as a leader. Because I mean, I lead and I work with teams and high caliber people. And then also it's interesting to know how, and I'm cognizant that every word that we say as leaders has a dramatic compounding effect on the other person, and always being aware that we use the right words, language, and situations. So I think I know where this is going with the emotional IQ, is that on every interaction that we're taking to our audience, everything that you're doing every single day, being aware of that and being able to do the inner workings to make sure, are you giving more than you're receiving? And are you also like in a positive way giving, but also are things sucking the energy out of you? And maybe
it's more than your words. It's actually your emotions. We have these specialized cells in our prefrontal cortex that brain scientists call mirror neurons.
Mm.
So in other words, because we've evolved from herds, we live in society, we've developed the ability to sense whether somebody's trying to help us or eat us. You can't fake being authentic. Your words have to be reflected in your actions. Actions are occurring with your walls down, then automatically people are going to gravitate towards you. You're going to become a more inspirational leader. If your underlying emotions are causing them to raise their walls, uh, people aren't going to have that same level of trust and respect, regardless of what the words are.
And it's a good practice because you are right with that. And I think also back to the history around when we learn to communicate, we also learn to lie. And then we also have to practice discerning the truth from someone lying to get advantage of another person. But that's besides the point. Where you just mentioned too. It's being in integrity with your actions and your words. But this also comes into like a reflection point, like for us listeners and for us, even myself as a practitioner of like a daily practice. Is it important to also look at every situation, be able to assess how did I react to that? How did I behave? How did I feel? In being able to work through those situations and say, could I have responded differently? What could I have done better? Is that part of this practice of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, yes, it is. It's an ongoing part of the practice. What I often do with what I always do with people I'm coaching is they're practicing these various habits that they're learning, and then we're discussing on a weekly basis the results. I said, when
Yeah.
you were communicating authentically, for instance, when you were telling the truth with compassion, how did that make you feel?
Mhm.
What did you learn? And do you think that action of telling the truth with compassion earned or burned trust with the other person? Conversely, if you used a habit where you were less compassionate and more focused on telling the truth, how did that work? How did you feel when you behaved that way? What did you learn when you behaved that way? And when you behave that way, do you think you earned or burned trust in a relationship with the other person? So it's a constant comparison between the old habit and the new habit to see which gets you the best results.
That makes a lot of
By the
sense.
way, the new habits always get you the best results.
Yeah, it's usually how
But
it goes. No, this is really interesting. So I think for our listeners out there, it's important to be aware of the other person, important to be aware that there's other emotional things happening in the other person's brain. And sometimes they're showing to us that either they don't like us or if there is a conflict, it's not usually because of us. But then also to be able to reflect through each interaction and communication, as well as on our actions to see, are we in alignment with our integrity, with who we are, and being able to, like you mentioned, habitually do this day in and day out, which equals some level of progress in the beginning, but a more dramatic progress over time with your example of the 30 and 40 days. Is there a certain point where we are in like a maintenance mode, or is this always growth and compounding? Or is this work practice? It's just like a lifelong work, like any skill.
it's a lifelong practice.
Yeah.
There is no ending point. As you practice, the habits get stronger. Um, but the old saying, when you're not getting better, you're not being good. So the point is that all of our existing habits, once you develop a habit, it's there forever. So even though you're developing these new habits that work better than the old habits, they're weaker than the old habits, and there's always going to be an internal conflict for control, for dominance between the old and the new habits. So that, along with the cortisol, um, I mentioned earlier, is part of our built-in biological resistance to change. There's also a sociological resistance to change, meaning that the people around us don't want us to change. We've taught them how they can steal our energy. And by the way, they've taught us how we can steal theirs. So if we change and we start to get better results than we're currently getting, maybe they're going to have to change. That scares the hell out of them. And the best way to ensure they don't have to change is to make sure we fail. So we can say, look, I told you, now get your head back down and get back in the herd with the rest of us. And that's happening largely on an unconscious level.
Yeah, that's what I have to say.
The point is that these are two very distinct, very challenging sources that we have of resistance to change in our day-to-day life, even when we know what to do. So it has to be an ongoing, lifelong practice.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that, especially. Phil, I think for our listeners out there, what's the best place for people to, one, thank you for this episode and also learn a little bit more about the practice and maybe a resource of how to implement this in their life?
I'd be happy. The best way to contact me is through on my LinkedIn profile. My calendar's there, and if they'd like to meet via Zoom, they can just pick a date on the calendar, and I'd be happy to chat with them.
Cool. We'll put that link on the show notes. And Phil, thank you for sharing this with us today. And hopefully this was a positive exchange of energy for you as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Raul. It was a pleasure to be on your show.
Hey, thank you for being here with us today. It's an honor to be a small part of your journey. If you gain any new insights on today's episode with Phil, please head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a comment with the insight that you've learned. While you're there, you can also leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have any topic suggestions or questions that you'd like us to go deeper on the podcast, please drop us a line at podcast@dogoodwork.io. That's podcast@dogoodwork.io. This is Raul Hernandez. Do good work.